By 1820, the United States was becoming a white men's democracy, as states amended their constitutions to abolish property qualifications for voting. Remnants of the Federalist Party in New England and prosperous businessmen throughout the Union formed the nucleus of the Whig Party, whose twin concerns were fears of presidential tyranny under Andrew Jackson and fears that democracy might turn into mere demagogy. They suffered a jarring defeat in the Bank War of 1830-32, when President Jackson vetoed legislation for the renewal of the bank's charter. To them, the veto was an assertion of tyrannical power and an unscrupulous appeal to citizens' class resentments. The event seemed almost a textbook illustration of their thinking. If unpropertied men are allowed to vote, is it not likely that they will seize the property of the men who have it? Is it not likely also that demagogues will arise to manipulate their fears and whip up hatred against the rich? Jackson, in their view, was the tyrant, and the destruction of the bank augured economic chaos. Daniel Webster and Henry Clay became the great Whig leaders, eager for responsible government, fiscal responsibility, national economic improvements, and preservation of the Union. Webster's speeches on the sanctity of the Union created a profound impression on a young Illinois Whig named Abraham Lincoln. Well, Andrew Jackson alarmed Northern conservatives by manipulating popular passions, by ignoring the Supreme Court, and by destroying the second bank of the United States. Right from the beginning, he seemed troublesome to conservatives. His inauguration itself looked like a disgraceful mob scene. Until then, all presidents had been inaugurated indoors. Jackson's, for the first time, was held outdoors, so far more people could attend. A messy parade of members of all social classes then took place down to the White House, and there was a free-for-all at the reception where everyone was invited. The flowers were trampled in the White House gardens, and there was a lot of noisy drunks on the grounds. One conservative lady described the scene as a rabble, a mob of boys, Negroes, women, children, scrambling, fighting, romping. Justice Joseph Story, a very sober member of the Supreme Court, said this was the reign of King Mob. President Jackson defied the Supreme Court over the fate of the 5 civilized tribes. Jackson had made his name as an Indian fighter, and then had won the Battle of New Orleans at the end of the War of 1812. This was in 1815, when the war had actually finished, but news of the treaty had not yet reached America. And Jackson seemed potentially like America's version of Napoleon, the military strongman who then seizes absolute power and manipulates the emotions of the people. He favored removing 5 tribes of American Indians, the Creeks, Cherokees, Seminoles, Choctaws and Chickasaws, from the lands they'd historically lived on, particularly once gold had been discovered in North Georgia, Cherokee country. He wanted them to be displaced to the west, preferably beyond the Mississippi River. And an act of Congress authorized this removal in 1830. The Supreme Court ruled against it in a case called Worcester versus Georgia, decided in 1832. And the old Federalist, John Marshall, was still Chief Justice, albeit nearing the end of his years on the bench. President Jackson defied him, allegedly declaring, "John Marshall has made his decision. Let him enforce it now if he can." And the inability of the Supreme Court to counteract Jackson's popularity led to the disgraceful Trail of Tears of 1838, the forcible displacement of the Cherokee people, many of whom, perhaps as many as 4,000 of whom, died en route to the west. Well, President Jackson also opposed the second bank of the United States and was particularly opposed to its president, Nicholas Biddle. In Jackson's view, Biddle and the bank were examples of economic elitism at its worst. And so when the opportunity to extend the bank's charter came along in 1832, Jackson vetoed it and forced the ending of the bank. Alexander Hamilton had created the first bank of the United States back in the very first days of the Republic under the Constitution. And President Madison had created the second in the year 1816 with a 20-year charter. And the role of the bank was to manage the currency. This was an important matter because in the early days of the Republic, there had been terrible years of inflation and dozens of competing currencies, so that it was very difficult to have a reliable medium of exchange. But the first and then the second national banks introduced some fiscal regularity, and which itself built the confidence of businesses. The bank was designed to prevent reckless lending by other banks, and it held on to government revenues. It seemed to be doing an excellent job so long as you looked at it purely from an economic point of view. Nicholas Biddle was a well-educated Philadelphian. He graduated from Princeton at the age of 15 with his BA. He was a friend of Lewis and Clark and wrote a book about them. One British visitor described Biddle as the most perfect specimen of an American gentleman. But there's a downside to Nicholas Biddle. Listen to the American historian Sean Wilentz describing him. Wilentz says, quote, "The bank made its decisions behind closed doors, and these decisions were made by a man who declared himself beholden to no elected official in the land. Biddle, with his haughty bearing and his presumption that democracy was demagogy, personified the Jacksonians' charges that the bank threatened popular sovereignty." We can see again here the recurrence of a conflict we've looked at many times in the course already. The conservative tendency to believe that democracy ought to be avoided, especially if a complicated matter is at stake, like the preservation of the national currency. And the democratic point of view that people who've got great authority ought to be directly answerable to the electors themselves. Nicholas Biddle's friends in the business community encouraged him to introduce legislation for the rechartering of the bank for extending its 20-year charter before the election of 1832, even though it wasn't until 36 that the charter was going to lapse. As they had predicted, the rechartering legislation sailed through both houses of Congress without difficulty, but then President Jackson vetoed it. And in his veto message, he said that the bank was an affront to the simple farmers and the ordinary citizens of the United States. Biddle was horrified by the veto and said he regarded it as a declaration of Jacobinism. The veto message, he said, has all the fury of a chained panther biting at the bars of his cage. It really is a manifesto of anarchy, such as Marat or Robespierre might have issued to the mob. Well, after the lapse of the second bank, which never was rechartered, the nation entered a period of chaotic financial upheavals in the late 1830s, including a very, very severe business depression in 1837. Looked at from an economic point of view, it would almost certainly have been wiser to keep the bank. But Jackson was resolute in getting rid of it as what he saw as an unjustified form of special undemocratic privilege. Well, the Whig Party grew up in opposition to Jackson, and it represented the principles of hierarchy, social stability, nationally assisted economic growth, and respect for the Union. It took on many of the characteristics of the Old Federalists, and some surviving Old Federalists, in fact, became Whigs in their turn. The Jacksonian Democrats, on the other hand, had a different idea, a different vision of what the Republic ought to be like. The Democrats' view was that America should be a society of independent small farmers. The Democrats were very much opposed to the idea of concentrated wealth and concentrated populations. Like John Taylor, whom I mentioned last time, they liked the idea of the special virtue of the independent farmer. They favoured broad expansion into the American West, into the territory which had been made available by the Louisiana Purchase. They were suspicious of experts, suspicious of specialisation. And they held the populist idea, which has been very, very durable in American history right up to the present, that ordinary people can be trusted to do most tasks just fine, that it's actually wrong to put your faith too much in specialists and experts. The Democrats tended to take the view that even judges should be elected, because that way you'd have an absolute maximum of democracy, and all white men should be regarded as each other's equals. And there was a particular suspicion among the Democrats of bankers, who are often the devil figures in their iconography. Now, the new Whig Party disagreed all down the line. Their vision of the Republic was as different as could be. They weren't against farmers, but they favoured a mixed economy made up of farmers and industrialists and merchants. They thought that the proliferation of banks and credit facilities, so long as they were responsible, was a very, very good thing for economic growth. And they were actively in favour of specialisation. As society became more complicated, they said, it becomes more and more appropriate for us to have specialised people who are highly educated to do the particular jobs necessary in a complex society. They were very, very cautious about equality and democracy, although, of course, they recognised the need to campaign in a democratic environment. And they said, expertise is becoming more necessary as the world gets more complicated. They certainly didn't favour the election of judges. No, they said, judges are highly trained in a specialised and arcane craft, and they need to be exempt from popular pressures because they need to be able to decide cases strictly on the merits, and they must be exempted from popular pressures. The Whigs believed very, very strongly in the preeminent importance of virtue in political life, carrying on the 18th century tradition embodied in the revolutionary ideals. And this is why they took the name Whigs. They're bringing back to life again the memory of the people who'd stood up to the danger of royal tyranny at the time of the Revolution. And one of their names for Andrew Jackson was King Andrew. That's meant to summon up in voters' minds the analogy with King George III, King Andrew the tyrant. But of course, as I say, they had to temper their rhetoric, because as democracy among men became universal, they needed to compete in elections. And in fact, the Whigs became very, very effective at electioneering, posing as ordinary common folks, just as the Democratic candidates were. We can see in the work of Calvin Colton a representative figure. Calvin Colton was a Whig writer of the 1830s and 40s. Like many American conservatives before and since, he was an Anglophile, a great lover and admirer of Britain. And we first find in people like Calvin Colton the mood which is still so evident in lovers of masterpiece theatre, for example. He was a great believer in the defence of tradition, and very often he sounded like Edmund Burke in the way in which he eulogised the traditional character of English life. Colton wrote, "It is a real substantial English virtue that keeps things steady, so that you may know what to depend upon, and it operates generally for the public good. Immemorial usage in any country, if it concerns everybody and relates to practical everyday interests, is generally right and may be presumed so." If you didn't know that that was by Colton, you could easily mistake it as being written by Edmund Burke. Colton dreaded Andrew Jackson as another Napoleon or another Caesar. He said, "The great struggle in America, on which the fate of the Republic is suspended, is between the Constitution and democracy. The Constitution is the bulwark of the nation's safety, but the dynasty of public opinion is constantly assailing it. And whether the Constitution will yet give way altogether and totter and fall to the ground remains to be proved." Here's again a striking juxtaposition of democracy and the Constitution against one another, rather than the assumption which we'd assume today that the two go hand in hand. Colton also deplored the emotional excesses of the Second Great Awakening. The period of the 1820s and 30s was a period of great revivals, and the most prominent revivalist preacher of the era was Charles Grandison Finney, a theatrical mesmerizer. Colton, on the other hand, was an Episcopalian, a member of a church which values restraint and subdued piety and studious faith. The Episcopalian idea is that you become a real Christian through engagement of the intellect, not the passions, because the passions are fickle and shallow. This again you might see as a characteristic conservative claim, that emotional religion doesn't engage the mind, but if it's going to stick, it needs to engage the whole being. Colton regretted the moral absolutism that often went with revivalism, especially when revivalism was linked with the work of the abolitionists. Now, it's interesting to see the Whig ideas about slavery, and again, Colton in some ways is a representative figure. He wasn't pro-slavery, but he hated the abolitionists. If he'd had to choose between slavery and abolitionism, he'd probably have chosen slavery, because he thought that the abolitionists were the most dangerous people. Why? Because they'd made the pro-slavery advocates more intransigent. This was probably true, as we saw last time, that the pro-slavery arguments were strengthened in the face of abolitionism. And, says Colton, the zealotry of the abolitionists threatens the virtues of moderation and compromise upon which the stability of the Republic rests. One of the most famous Whigs was Daniel Webster. And Webster's famous also as among the greatest of American orators. It was Webster who encouraged a sense of veneration for the Union itself. And in an age of grand oratory, he was one of the very grandest. He came from New Hampshire and had a long political career, mainly in the service of Massachusetts. He was a graduate of Dartmouth College and a Federalist lawyer in his early life, who eventually pleaded 170 times before the Supreme Court. He and John Marshall knew each other well because he appeared so often in Marshall's court. Now, by the 1820s, when Daniel Webster was at the height of his oratorical powers, the founding fathers, the men who'd written the Constitution in the 1780s, were dying out. Two of the most famous, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, both died on July the 4th, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, itself a momentous coincidence. Webster contributed to creating an aura of reverence around the Founding Fathers and their memory, turning them into almost sacred figures of national tradition. Now his theory, Webster's theory, was the exact opposite of Calhoun's. Calhoun had asserted that the states had prior sovereignty, and that when the state came into conflict with the federal union, the state had the right to assert its sovereignty. Webster, by contrast, says, no, the union has sovereignty, and it takes precedence over the states. This is one of the issues over which one of the theoretical issues over which the Civil War was to be fought. I'd like to read to you from Webster's famous speech, The Second Reply to Hayne. This is when he was refuting one of Calhoun's deputies in 1830. And this was a speech which lasted for the best part of 2 days before the Senate, which was crowded to overflowing, and many of the audience members and many of the members of the Senate itself were weeping openly at the peroration because they were so moved by Webster's rhetoric. Here's how he ends. When my eyes shall be turned to behold for the last time the sun in heaven, may I not see him shining on the broken and dishonoured fragments of a once glorious union, on states dissevered, discordant, belligerent, on a land rent with civil feuds, or drenched it may be in fraternal blood. Let their last feeble and lingering glance behold the gorgeous ensign of the Republic, now known and honoured throughout the earth, still full high advanced, its arms and trophies streaming in their original lustre, not a stripe erased or polluted, not a single star obscured, bearing for its motto everywhere, spread all over in characters of living light, blazing on all its ample folds as they float over the sea and over the land, and in every wind under the whole heavens, that sentiment dear to every true American heart, liberty and union, now and forever, one and inseparable. Well, this speech, and particularly its famous ending, was later much anthologized. It was learned off by heart by generations of school children. It was recited in public speaking classes because of its pathos and its grandeur, this idea that Webster, as he dies, wants to behold the flag proudly flying as ever. And this absolutely classic example of Whig rhetoric exalting the Union. It certainly had a very profound influence on the young Abraham Lincoln, whose vision of the Union was closely modelled on his own, and which would be invoked by Lincoln when it came to the crisis of the Civil War. Another of the most important Whigs was Henry Clay of Kentucky. Clay was an advocate of compromise on behalf of the Union, and that had the effect that he antagonized everybody. Extremists on both sides were dissatisfied with Clay's moderate temperament. He antagonized fire-eating Southerners on one side and abolitionist absolutists on the other. Clay was a Kentuckian, a slave owner, and he played a big role in all three of the major compromises which kept the Union together in the years leading up to secession. He was one of the important figures in working out the Missouri Compromise in 1820, which I described last time. He was the vital figure in developing the 1832 Compromise to end the nullification crisis, again, a point I mentioned last time. And finally, he was the broker of the 1850 Compromise, which agreed to the principle that California should be admitted to the Union as a free labor state, that slavery should be abolished in the District of Columbia, but that as a quid pro quo, Northerners must be responsible for returning escaped slaves, the so-called fugitive slave law. Once again, he was very influential over Abraham Lincoln, who sometimes called himself an old-line Henry Clay Whig. Another great orator for the Whig cause was Rufus Choate, who explained the Whig idea of reverence for the law. Choate shared Webster's idea of an organic community stretching across time, gradually changing in its outward details, but essentially the same across the generations. And Choate said, law is the link between the past and the present and the future, which binds us together as an organic community. In a speech to the Harvard Law School, the graduating class of 1845, he glorified, quote, the sacred sentiments of obedience and reverence and justice, of the supremacy of the calm and grand reason of the law over the fitful will of the individual and the crowd. And again there's classic conservative rhetoric, the fitful will of the crowd and the granitic certainty of the law. Alexis de Tocqueville visited America in 1831 to 1832, and he wrote a conservative classic about his experiences. De Tocqueville was a young French aristocrat living in an era of great political turbulence. Anyone growing up in France in the early part of the 19th century was familiar with violent changes of government. First the revolution itself in 1789, then the rise of Napoleon. Some of Tocqueville's own relatives were sent to the guillotine. Then the restoration of the monarchy in 1815 after the Battle of Waterloo, then the July Revolution of 1830, then another revolution in 1848. Now Tocqueville came to America ostensibly as a prison reformer, but he became fascinated by many other aspects of American life, and he struggled with the fact that America, a democracy, which was supposed to be an unstable form of government, was actually dealing with changes of government relatively peacefully, and didn't have the frequent revolutionary upheavals which punctuated French life at the same time. That was the paradox that Tocqueville was working with. Why is American democracy proving to be so politically stable when all our theorizing tells us that democracies are unstable? His great two-volume book came out first in 1835 and then in 1840, the two volumes. It was very popular, first in Europe and then in translation back here in the United States, and has remained a great classic, probably the most important book by a foreigner about America ever written. And it's an interesting mixture of praise and blame for America and for democracy itself. De Tocqueville was impressed by Americans' enthusiasm, not just for participating in politics, but also for participating in voluntary societies and associations. And Tocqueville said, the great thing about voluntary societies, which the Americans love so much, is that they help to bind the population together. And participation in societies teaches the citizens how to cooperate with one another in civic affairs. They're very effective intermediate organisations between the individual and the family on the one hand, and the state on the other. Later in the course, we're going to see how another group of American conservatives, the neoconservatives, picked up this same insight and described with great enthusiasm what they called mediating institutions, the intermediate voluntary organisations which bind a society together. De Tocqueville also noticed the power of peer pressure in America. He says, unlike in aristocratic Europe, no one in America is allowed to portray themselves as better than the masses, as deserving of leadership. So what that means is that the leaders are actually not the best people, but the most manipulative. Not the most virtuous, but the ones who give the impression of being most virtuous. And Tocqueville points out, democratic politicians know how to give the appearance of being ordinary folks, while actually having exceptional abilities. In other words, he's right on the brink of saying that democracy promotes insincerity among politicians, and it certainly promotes the tendency to flatter the voters. The very worst characteristic of mass democracy, in Tocqueville's view, was that it promotes envy by denying that anyone has the right to be better than anyone else. Now we think that liberty and equality go together, but Tocqueville thought that they were opposites, and that the passion for equality might actually have the effect of destroying liberty. He wrote, "There is a manful and lawful passion for equality that incites men to wish all to be powerful and honoured. This passion tends to elevate the humble to the rank of the great. But there exists also in the human heart a depraved taste for equality, which impels the weak to attempt to lower the powerful to their own level and reduces men to prefer equality in slavery to inequality with freedom. Not that those nations whose social condition is democratic naturally despise liberty. On the contrary, they have an instinctive love of it. But liberty is not the chief and constant object of their desires. Equality is their idol. Nothing can satisfy them without equality, and they would rather perish than lose it. Well, it's infinitely worthwhile to read Tocqueville. Almost every chapter has got little nuggets of insight, and it's particularly astonishing that, although it was written in the 1830s, it still speaks to us so clearly even today. Certainly when you think of contemporary American politicians, you might be struck by the resonance of some of those remarks. An elite of the conservative Whigs regarded themselves as the guardians of civilization, whose task it was to bring to America and nurture here the highest achievements of Western civilization. After the Revolution, America had had to decide whether it wanted to turn away from wicked old Europe altogether and create a different culture of its own, or whether it wanted to take what was best in European civilization and refine it and purify it. Not surprisingly, conservatives took the second view, that is, to hold on to the very best of European civilization. And they struggled in the years before the American Civil War to make this young democracy less raw and more civilized. George Ticknor was one of the figures who did a lot towards that. He was an outstanding linguist and author. And he tried to improve Harvard University, where he worked for much of his life, and to build up the cultural institutions of Boston. As a young man, Ticknor studied at Göttingen, one of the very first Americans to go on the pilgrimage to German universities, which later on became common. And he was absolutely astonished at the high quality of the library at Göttingen and the high attainments of its best scholars. In his letters home to his parents, he says, "There's just nothing remotely like it anywhere in America." When he came back and became a professor of modern languages at Harvard, he began to institute teaching reforms, such as the graded teaching of modern European languages. But he had to do it very largely in the face of resistance and indifference from much of the rest of the faculty. Ticknor wrote that he was a particular expert in Spanish, and he wrote the first general history of Spanish literature in the English language, which became a standard work in Spain as well as in America. That was in 1849. Ticknor was also the founder and promoter of the Boston Public Library, which was founded in 1854. He wanted to give ordinary citizens greater access to books at a time when there were still very valuable commodities that ordinary citizens couldn't afford to buy for themselves. Another figure comparable in some ways to Ticknor was Edward Everett, who devoted half his career to education and half to politics, as he too endeavoured to civilize the rough and ready democracy of New England. He also went to Göttingen and was the first American to get a PhD in Germany in the discipline of philology. Edward Everett became a Harvard professor as well, and he was one of the teachers of the young Ralph Waldo Emerson, who acknowledged a debt of gratitude to him. He was an admirer of the classics, and he tried to exhort young Americans to emulate the great classical heroes. At various times, Everett was the governor of Massachusetts, a representative, a senator, and even a presidential candidate in the election of 1860. But he found the rough and tumble of democratic politics horrible. He certainly didn't enjoy the electioneering, which was now necessary, equally for Whigs and for Democrats. Much more to his taste was being the American ambassador to England. He enjoyed hobnobbing with Queen Victoria and with the courtiers around her. When he came back, he hated being president of Harvard University. The students' nickname for him was Old Granny, and they played practical jokes on him all the time, such as letting off firecrackers indoors, nailing shut his door, setting great bonfires and having drunken revels in Harvard Yard. Everett would have liked Harvard University to be a centre of civilization, but it wasn't. In those days it was still a rough and tumble boys' academy. This is the great plight of elitists in democratic nations, which to some extent persists right up to the present. Well, I think it's clear from these lectures that Southern conservatism before the Civil War and Northern conservatism were very, very different things. And from their differences grew the conflict, which eventually was to lead to the Civil War. Calhoun, the great Southern conservative, and Webster and Clay, the great Whig conservatives, all died in the early 1850s. But their competing forms of conservatism had helped set the stage for the coming catastrophe. But before we move on to the American Civil War itself, I'd like us now to go back to Britain and see how British conservatism was developing after the Napoleonic Wars.